Good morning again, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. I must say that that video has really put us in the mood. We feel as if we are in Poznan. The first keynote of this conference is by Professor Bernard Dann, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce him. Professor Dann is a professor of neurophysiology and developmental neurology in Brussels. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology Journal, and of course, a close friend. So it is a real pleasure, Bernard, to introduce you. Bernard is a prolific researcher with over 250 research articles and author of many seminal books in our field and beyond, including his single author book on Angelman syndrome, which is absolutely authoritative. His role as the chief editor has been of the DMCN has saw the journal reach the highest impact factor that it has ever had. Congratulations, Bernard, on that. It is a real achievement. Bernard's editorial touch continues to mold our opinions and expertise in the field of neurodevelopmental medicine. Bernard is the recipient of many honors, prizes, and distinctions, and he is the first recipient of the prestigious Elsas Foundation Research Prize in Neurodevelopmental Medicine in 2019. Outside of the developmental pediatric practice, Bernard has served as scientific curator for several art exhibitions relating to disability, and is also an award-winning author of novels and short stories. And as we are in Poznan, it is worth noting that one of his works has been translated into Polish as well. Now, Bernard has a rare knack of making even the most complex scientific data simple and easy to understand and very interesting for anyone, whatever their level of understanding may be. And his presentations and writing are always a treat. So be prepared for an orchestral synthesis of science, art, history, and of course, philosophy. Ladies and gentlemen, without much further ado, I would like to welcome Bernard to do his first keynote lecture for this conference on the lifespan development with a neurodevelopmental disorder. Just one short ground rule, which is that I will be monitoring the chat. So please keep posting your questions and comments. And then at the end, we will have about 10 minutes for discussion. Thank you, Bernard. Over to you.
Good morning. Well, it's really good to be here, and I really feel I am in Poznan. Thank you very much, Marek. Thank you for these very kind words, Arnab. Now, when I had to say a title for what I was going to present, this was just the title of a lecture that I would have liked to hear and learn a lot about. But then today it's my task, and I tried to think about this topic, and I realized that there is a lot that we still have to know. Now, it is the 32nd annual meeting of our academy, and I went into fortune telling and I found that the card number 32 corresponds to Chronico, the genius of time. And of course, 32, also in Kabbalistic terms, is the number of paths to wisdom. So I hope those will guide us throughout the meeting. Development has for a long time been equated with maturation. So neurological development with brain maturation. And these are a series of brains, obviously not from the same individual, extracted as they were from their jewel box. And I think to us, it's a good reminder of the macroscopic changes that the brain undergoes during fetal life. It can be fetal life, but it can also be postnatal life for people born preterm, as macroscopically the brain looks the same. So the numbers you see are the numbers of weeks gestation, and the bottom right brain is the brain as it looks at term. Brain we can recognize, and for a long time development has been considered to start just there, from then on. This idea that development was biological maturation and that was just equivalent was also based on observation. But it all depends on what you observe. If you observe certain characters, reflexes, and so on, they seem to be directly related to brain maturation. If you look at them outside context, outside functionality. And this has been a good way of doing developmental neurology for a long time, and it has taught us a lot. But now we must realize that functioning is also very relevant to the very concept of development. And thus, development became maturation plus experience. But then we realize that experience is very complex. And even if you take the complexity into account, there remains factors that are not accounted for. So development is now considered as maturation, but also experience, and also other factors which we currently call chance. It is possible that in future years we'll be able to name a few of those factors more accurately. But I'm personally convinced that a probabilistic approach will remain a requirement when we consider the development. Now, when we talk about experience, we know that the experience really starts in the womb. And that part of experience is important, increasingly important as we better understand it. But also the very early experiences that one can make in relationship with the world, including direct interaction with individuals and the wider world. And there you see this window. And let's tread that path together. This is opened to rekindling a concept which had been used in clinical neurology and also basic science in neurology, and that is neuroplasticity. And that started as a concept with the idea of how can you see repair, neural repair after a lesion. But now we know that the concept is much wider. So it used to be an exception, but now we know that it's the rule, and that plasticity doesn't just have to do with lesions, but this is just how we function. We can define it roughly as the capacity of neurons, but now also neural networks to alter their connections, but also their physiological behavior in response to experience. So a change of structure as a result of function. But the neuroplasticity can be structural, but it can also be functional. And we have to remember that it can also be maladaptive. For example, if some neural networks are preferentially used like in seizure disorders, that will strengthen connections and result in making these networks even more used, and that can be maladaptive. We know more and more mechanisms in plasticity, and perhaps at this stage it's difficult to name all these mechanisms under the same umbrella term of neuroplasticity. And so I'm anticipating that we can go further. First of all, trying to make a distinction between functional and structural plasticity, but also thinking about the link between functional and structural plasticity. So functional neuroplasticity can certainly be observed at the level of the physiological functioning of individual neurons. And I'm talking about excitability, how a neuron will respond to a stimulus, a higher response, a lower response, and how that response level itself can also be further modulated. But also, as I said, networks are important. So the activities that are shared within networks, we're very much interested now in synchronicity. But possibly there are also some patterns of organization that go beyond just being synchronous. LTP stands for long-term potentiation, which is synaptic plasticity. But you also have the opposite, and often of those same synapses, long-term depression, or LTD. And with use, we can see that there can be remapping of functions. So we're drifting from a rigid vision of localizing neurology, and developmental neurology has taught us a great deal. I'm talking about the synapse and the functioning of the synapse, but synapses can also change their structure, their microscopic structure at the level of dendritic spines and the expression of certain receptors. And that makes a nice link with structural neuroplasticity, which we can approach in vivo through neuroimaging, for example, following tracts or measuring volumes. We knew about the production of new synapses. We knew about the production of new axons and dendrites. We call them neurites as a whole, and also changes in myelin. But there's been increasing interest in the generation of new neurons. So when I was at school, medical school, I learned that the adult brain or even the child's brain in the humans, unlike other mammals, does not produce new neurons. But we know that that is not the case. What we do not know is what the relevance, what the significance is of those new neurons, but they can be produced in several areas of the brain. So overall, it seems to be more interesting to understand development more as individual trajectories than as following a pre-written script. When people in social psychology, for example, think about lifespan development, they think along notions like the timing of events and the sequence of life events. And as I said, trajectories, and in studies, they would readily study specific aspects of functioning, as we tend to do also in neurodevelopmental disorders. And when we ask people how they view their own lifespan development, or how they think that the humankind is developing, they base their reasoning on two dimensions. One is their personal experience about themselves, but also what they observed in others, but also what can be called scripts, which emerge from the culture and which are normative. And I think these are very important, because as long as we think that those scripts are the truth, we less prepared to challenge them. And for example, we have a lot of ideas about aging, which may not relate to the reality as we observe it. The lifespan development can be approached through those trajectories, and you may know of the Human Connectome project. Now, It sounds really good and it sounds like the Human Genome Project, but I think that the analogy stops very early because it's much less comprehensive, and yet having banks of many data from many people will give us a better idea. And I think that it's better to have an idea of based on facts and observations, and also realizing that what we can use for thinking is more than what has been observed in some idealized group, as we often do in research. So there is now a project for extending the Human Connectome project throughout the lifespan, including aging. To us, I think it remains very interesting to tell stories, to approach those trajectories as narratives, and we must realize that they shape identities, and that these identities still are constructions, as any identity are. Now, thinking about lifespan development in general, we must realize that not only are children not small adults, but adults are not big children. And in the realm of neurodevelopmental disability in particular, we need to stress this notion that adults with neurodevelopmental disabilities are not big children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Marek alluded to F words. Here we clearly into projections into the future, but also in the present. And we must be prepared to look at differences, at specificities in individuals who are grown-ups. What we have for the moment is literature, and maybe I made those arrows too thick and thicker than what they are. Later childhood in many neurodevelopmental disabilities have been relatively more studied than other periods. And then you see other periods, the fetal period hardly at all, and then aging really hardly at all. And so I try to create proportions, but I say these are artificials. And perhaps the main message of this slide is not the horizontal line and arrow, because we tend not to look at continuity in change, but more to have side-by-side periods, as though infancy was a discrete period separated from the perinatal period and from early childhood, as though adolescence was something so specific that it doesn't really link to young adulthood or even late childhood. The topic of aging in particular has not been addressed enough in neurodevelopmental disability. Maybe because we're still carrying the idea that the specialists and the specialist services should be designed specifically for children with neurodevelopmental disability, and that perhaps dates from a time when the life expectancy was much shorter than what it is now. We do have some notion about life expectancy in a number of conditions and in a number of settings, but they're very limited. And even what you find in the literature is often projections that are wishful thinking. So I often hear that in such and such neurogenetic condition, life expectancy is normal. Well, it's almost never the case. So which norm? And if you take the norm of the vast general population, we have to know that some factors like intellectual disability or motor impairment exert a great influence on reducing life expectancy. Now, aging is a universal phenomenon, which we tend to understand more and more. And it's a phenomenon of change, but at the same time, there's reduced change in a lot of the plasticity that I mentioned earlier. So plasticity still occurs, but certainly not as dramatically as much earlier in life. The changes are very, very wide, over wide areas, certainly physical, mental, social. And here I highlight chronic disuse. And maybe that can be seen in the general population also to a significant extent, that people as they age become more sedentary and use their systems less than earlier. And we know that some of the processes that we attribute to aging are actually more readily attributable to chronic disuse. And that to a great we can mitigate them for a great part, and even some of them are even reversible. What is common in the general population and what is perhaps exaggerated in people with neurodevelopmental disabilities is a perception of aging, which is very, very strong. And so when people start to have this perception for themselves, or if people are in an environment where everyone looks at them with a perception that they have accelerated aging, this creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, encouraging chronic disuse, discouraging more autonomy. I'm saying this not based on hard science. We do not have hard data about it. But this is not guesswork either. This is based on a number of small studies from different fields. And you can find in all those studies great convergence in this notion of a perception of accelerated aging. I am not saying that accelerated aging does not exist in neurodevelopmental disorders. Some disorders are characterized by mechanisms that express themselves with accelerated aging. I'm thinking of Cockayne syndrome, for example, but this is such a rare disease, and it's certainly not representative for the vast heterogeneity that we see in neurodevelopmental disorders as a whole. What's interesting is to think of what the gerontologists name the geriatric giants. Now, the difference between gerontology and geriatrics, as I understand it, is that geriatrics is a branch of medicine treating people, and gerontology is can also be a part of medicine, but not only, that's concerned with prevention and with improvement of situation and about good aging. Now, those classical giants were immobility, and this will be familiar to many people with neurodevelopmental disorders, instability, incontinence, and impaired cognitive function. The modern version of the geriatric giants are frailty, and I think that that concept is clinically useful in neurodevelopmental disability across the lifespan. Losing muscle, sarcopenia, that's also useful throughout the lifespan with different emphasis depending on many factors, including aging. Anorexia and cognitive impairment. So if we look at the literature, fortunately enough, there's starting to be literature on adults with neurodevelopmental disorders. Well, this is not that new. What is new is how many studies are getting published now, and also the focus of those studies. You can find important information like hospital admission. And here I took almost at random a list of recent publications of this year. And we can see the sort of problems that bring adults with cerebral palsy in this paper to the hospital. Or the question about falls in adults with cerebral palsy. Of course, this is an obvious problem, but the literature was very limited. And there's a lot of prevention to do in this topic. Pain is an increasingly recognized symptom in neurodevelopmental disorder. It is such a scandal that it took so many years for many of us, including myself, to be able to identify that people were in pain, and that there is something to do about pain. It's not just something that comes as part of the disorder and there's nothing to do about it. So I know it may sound shocking to our ears now, but I was even deep into this sort of reasoning, say 20 years ago. Interference with activities, and here you find back how we think in ICF terms. Sleep, which is so important, and all the psychological and psychiatric disorders, which were not readily recognized because their expression is different, and also because many clinicians thought that, well, it's just part of it, but they require specific evaluation and specific attention and management. Heart disease in Down syndrome, participation in sport and physical activity in adults with intellectual disabilities. And we know how societies have been evolving to being more inclusive. And we know how societies are slow in doing those changes, but how important participation, societal participation, and other aspects of participation are really essential in the value of life for many, many individuals. Mobility, driving in adults with autism. And what I liked in this paper is that they don't say disorder. It's on the autism spectrum, taking that concept to the full. And of course, employment. So I'm quoting a Nobel Prize here. The times they are changing. Well, indeed. Arnab mentioned the book I wrote about Angelman syndrome. When I started being interested in Angelman syndrome over 20 years ago, and I wanted to see a number of adults with Angelman syndrome, where did I find them? In institutions. And of course, you would find adults with neurodevelopmental disabilities in institutions. But that is not representative for the whole population of people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, including conditions like Angelman syndrome nowadays. But 20 years ago, the situation was quite different. And it's impressive not just to see that more people are into other solutions than institutions, but also that institutions have changed so much in so many parts of the world, and they have changed for the better. They have changed for better emphasis on individual needs, on individuals' quality of life. And so lifespan development with neurodevelopmental disorder will be different in 10 years, in 20 years than it is now. And the same can be said if you compare now to what it was like 10 or 20 years ago. Even those short spans, and 10 years, 20 years is short even for us human beings. Now, what I would have liked to see in a lecture on lifespan development in neurodevelopmental condition would have been a robust body of science. For example, saying that the loss of satellite cells as stem cells in muscles is so and so and so, and these are the implications. There are publications about it, but they're embryonic. I would have liked to see even autopsy material. I mean, since the advent of modern neuroimaging, we hardly see neuropathology anymore. And if you want to look at histologic specimens of neurons in neurodevelopmental disorders, the fashion is certainly not to address those that we commonly address, but schizophrenia in order to demonstrate that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. And that illustration on the bottom right is for that. Now, Olaf Verschuren suggested a formula for health and being in individuals with cerebral palsy. We know that many aspects of it can be generalized to other conditions. Or, well, when I say we know, we think. And even for cerebral palsy, I think more studies need to come and back this. But you need to start with this idea. And this formula may be a hypothesis, but I'm more than happy to test it. And it is for us not to overlook 3 fundamental aspects of functioning, and that is physical activity and sleep and adequate nutrition. And down at the bottom, I put 2 recent books that I really love, and I use them a lot for teaching. And that is one on the ICF, and you see this representation of the dimensions of the ICF, which links them even more closely together. And another book on participation. Now, in that book on participation, there is relatively little about the lifespan development, but all the ideas are there. All the material is there for us to use and work towards improved participation across the lifespan. Now, if we started at the very beginning, because as I said, development now doesn't start at birth, but prior to birth, we have more hypotheses that can guide us. And these are called the developmental origins of health and disease. And we know that a number of factors like nutrition that we mentioned, but also stress and infection and exposure to toxic agents, including sometimes medication, and also the microbiome, so the genome of the gut flora, can exert some influence. So we have some massive modeling based on many data. At the moment, it is still mostly a hypothesis, but I think it's a very interesting one. And one of the ways in which those determinants of experience can exert a role in the bone, in the fetus, is through epigenetic markings in the DNA, which can have very long-lasting effects. So we would start with genetic variation, epigenetic markers, and these marks can be very robust in the prenatal life, intrapartum period, and also in the early postnatal period, and lead thus to changes in the brain function and also in the brain structure, which manifest themselves with, well, differences in your behavior. This has been mostly studied in psychiatry, but I think there's a lot to do in the wider world of developmental disability. One word is prevention. And prevention, not just upstream, but as a continuous process. We always want to make things better, more close to real life, and more respectful, with a vision to the future. Here are stages of prevention, the primordial prevention, and you know very well probably the primary and secondary prevention. But be aware that the World Health Organization defined a tertiary level for prevention to soften the impact caused by disease on the functioning and quality of life. And a Belgian colleague a few years ago suggested even a further step for prevention to avoid over-medicalization, mitigate or avoid consequences of unnecessary or excessive intervention, etc., and suggest interventions ethically acceptable. 2 days ago at the GPEC, which was one of the pre-start primordial events of this meeting, I heard Peter Rosenbaum say that ICF started for disability and then health, but it is really for life. So I hope this whole meeting can be guided, illuminated by this idea that we're really working for life. And I would like to wish everyone to life, l'chaim. So my favorite words, we need to find those also throughout the lifespan, and maybe those for children apply across the lifespan, but it's worth sitting together with people with lived experience and having more and more and more words. Now, forward, and this is the name of a newspaper that was created in New York by people who had emigrated there from Poland. So the link is closed and we all close together. I thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. It was fantastic. That was an amazing exploration of the lifespan developmental concept and where we are at the moment and what we should look forward to for the future and what we need to do or think about. I would like to invite questions from the audience. Currently, I cannot see any particular questions or thoughts, but please post your questions for Bernard.
I can understand that. I have so many questions, but I don't have many answers, I'm afraid.
Maybe we can stop sharing the presentation. That's the last slide, isn't it, Bernard?
It is.
Wojtek, could we? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. While the questions come in, could I ask a question, Bernard? I think that was really thought-provoking. Now, you mentioned that there is the normal trajectory of aging, which for people with childhood neurodevelopmental disorders is likely to be different depending on what the condition is. But there's also the medical care aspects, the social expectations and support that is available. And then, of course, the other things that you talked about, which is the harm which sometimes comes from medical or social interventions. I know there is no research or answer to this. In your opinion, which ones are the ones that we as neurodevelopmental communities can actually scream and shout about and start making the most difference in?
I'll say how I am changing. So, and this is also an aspect of development. I think that I've started listening to people more. I think that I started fresh from medical school with medical knowledge and the idea that medical knowledge offers a degree of truth which is useful, but sometimes I thought that it was more useful than what I realize it is. And so the main thing is to develop another type of partnership, as we are doing now, with the people with lived experience. So the people who are patients as health professionals, we see them as patients, but realize that this is only one aspect in our relationship and one aspect in our lives. So themselves, the people around them, and society as a whole. And for society as a whole, we have to be advocates, because society often expects us to know better, and we see that for COVID, the role of scientific experts. We have to tell society, it's you are right in some of your expectations, but our way of thinking is not total, and there are other very important aspects, and we need to learn about them. So I think I thought I knew what cerebral palsy was when I started, and now the more I progress, the more I realize, no, I don't know, but I know enough to move together with people and move forward, and I have a role there, humbly.
I think we all do. We all certainly do. We have a couple of questions which have come in. The first one is, do you think that 2020 will affect the lifespan development in this group of children?
Yes, but yes. Can I share my concerns? This is the opening lecture. I think the societal response was, to me, very worrying. Not just very disappointing, but very worrying, because very quickly, so very early on, there were triage programs based on the expected utility of people and also the expected quality of life of people, as though thirds, so professionals, for example, could determine what the quality of life or the meaningful is of a person. Now, fortunately enough, the epidemiology has done that people with developmental disability have not been a particularly vulnerable group. That they are, but not particularly. So this is one thing that really worries me. So what are people in disability in society? But also the positive aspect is we have to reflect. We have been shaken in our ways of working, of thinking, and so I hope that as a consequence we can think better. But let us not forget all what we were trying to do in terms of empowerment and being close to people for who they are as individuals, and not bearing a label of I have this condition.
And I think there is an interesting comment which is kind of linked to that from Marek Josiak, which is that there is one more aspect which should be added to the 6 F words: social attitude to disability, child, youth, and adult with disability. There is a huge difference with that in relation to the cultural, regional, and social behavioral situations. So the attitudes need to change, and there is a huge difference even as we speak within Europe, you know, in our perspectives.
And we have a responsibility as individuals to move society further and to change the world. This might sound enormously ambitious, but I think it's good as a personal ambition for every one of us.
And I would add as an organizational ambition as well. There's another question for you here, Bernard. Is premature aging a danger for neurodevelopmental disorders? How should we handle this situation as the rehab team?
By analyzing and dissecting what aging is all about. So physiologically, we need to know more, and we don't have any more evidence that people with disability, and name a condition, have more premature aging, except for, as I say, Cockayne syndrome and a handful of other ultra rare conditions. But aging and suboptimal aging is a great danger for many people, and much more for people with neurodevelopmental disability. I mentioned chronic disuse because in 2 words you can say so much. But yes, we need to think, we need to be active, to be partners, to move, and so on and so on, and not by prescription. But this is because that's what life is all about. So it's good that professionals would say it, but professionals would say it to protect people and not to over-medicalize them either.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point in that earlier this year when we were running the GPEC workshop in India, the practitioners there told us they have a name for this condition of young adults who have become immobile in midlife, and you know, which is just from disuse. And they have actually now got a medical terminology to describe this. And one of their questions was, how do we address this? And this is, you know, within different societies, I suspect the degree of this is variable, and we certainly need to look out for this and prevent this happening.
And naming it is a good start. And the other thing is epigenetic changes might be more relevant than we think now. And so we need to be watchful for what's emerging there.
The questions are coming in thick and fast, Bernard. So we are going to have a rapid fire if we are to get through most of them.
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. You talked about lifespan views, health, and QOL. Any thoughts on happiness throughout the lifespan?
Yes, and that's the so-called disability paradox, which is often found. But so that people, despite disability, feel better than other people would anticipate. But don't make it as a rule. Quality of life assessment is something individual, and it's not because you have a disability that you're happier. But you can be happy despite having a disability. That's a message.
I'm sorry, somebody's moving these in addition.
This is a moving field.
But now they are at a room due to fears concerning COVID-19. What can I suggest to teachers and the ones who work with them under these conditions? Thanks.
Say it with other words, Anab.
Sorry?
So people are scared of COVID-19.
And therefore the children are now all locked away, and the opportunities to actually participate and things have kind of dwindled.
Think in terms of participation and creativity. So perhaps the answer is not just to go back to the world as it was a few months ago, but to make sure that participation is a target in itself and creativity is the way to get there.
Do you think we give enough attention to the right area of development, i.e. front-loaded to early intervention with infants? Is that what our priority should be, or should we be focusing?
That should be a priority also, but we need adult practitioners to come with us and to realize how fascinating, complex, interesting, and important it is. Otherwise, adults with neurodevelopmental conditions, as Camfield said, are known by no one, well known by no one, and that's a problem. So yeah, all the accents are fine. Don't do any less than what's been doing now, but also next to that, do more. Not only for transition, but for people who are adults, not becoming adults.
And I think the next question is linked to that, which is how can we make a better link between childhood and adulthood services at a national level to fit with our physiological, functional, and social perspectives and understanding? When
you say national, you say structure, and that's the problem. So try to be free from structure or use structures to open gates. The reason why I took notions from social psychology is precisely because we need to listen to people who think in parallel to us. So lifespan development is not something that's specific to us or specific to them. So we need to sit together and talk. Zoom is a great way now.
And the last question, I think, before we wrap up this session, Bernard, is how does the lifespan perspective change our ideas and research methodologies?
It changes, it reminds us the core of what we're doing and the target. What are we doing it for? Who are we doing it for? So it brings a lot of humility, but it brings a lot of power to studies which will be more relevant, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for an inspiring session. Thank you. I think this has really set the tone for the conference, and these are the discussions which we should be having over the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you very much.